In this video on an Inspector Calls AO2 quote, we're going to be looking at Gerald. When you're writing an AO2 response, it's best to think about it as zooming in. AO1, we zoom out and we look at the text as a whole, but for AO2, we're going to zoom in on a very specific piece of language. We're going to look at it closely and then we're going to analyse it, almost pulling it apart and looking at how it works. And then we're going to make some connections to the original question. The way we're going to do that is with SLEAL, and there's a sleeping seal there, as you can see. Statement, label, evidence, explain, analyse, and then link. Let's look at that more closely. When you're writing about AO2, the first thing you do is you make a statement. This is something that answers the question, so make sure you're referring to the question you were asked originally to make sure that your AO2 response is part of a wider response. Then you're going to label the main technique that forms the quote. Now there might be lots of smaller techniques within the quote, but you're looking for just one main technique, one main method that the writer's using, and you're going to label that. Then you'll immediately go into the evidence where you're going to write the quote out. Now longer quotes might need to be broken into smaller parts, but here you'll basically have the evidence that supports the statement you made at the beginning. Finally, you'll explain that evidence. You'll explain in one sentence, probably using because, to explain what that quote means, just a general understanding of it to form the foundation of your response, to make sure that you're clear. After that foundation, you're then going to build your response by analysing the quote. Now to do this using a SLEAL in AO2, we're going to focus on the words and phrases from the quote, the key bits of information. We're going to rewrite that as evidence again in our response, and we're going to label it each time we include a new word or phrase. We're going to try to include a technique, labeling them as we go. Then we'll talk about what the phrase means, perhaps in a literal way, and then we're going to explain what it suggests, what the deeper meanings are. And the more of those we can do, the better. Each time you write something, does it have more than one meaning? Does it suggest multiple things? If you can do that, that's going to be really useful for a deeper analysis. Then you might want to think about what connections you can make. So you can make connections to context. How does this quote relate to why the writer was writing? And does this quote link perhaps to any other points in the book? You'll do these probably after you've analysed some of the bigger ideas in the quote. Then think about the writer. What's the writer trying to show us? What do they want us to think? What ideas were they trying to share with us when they were writing this quote? And then finally, a link where you're going to make a comment that links your response back to the question that was asked at the start. So you're reminding the examiner that you're always talking about the question and that this AO2 response is part of that. So our quote for Gerald comes from the scene just as he's explaining to the rest of the family and to the inspector what he did to Eva Smith. He says, "I hate those hard-eyed, doe-faced women, young and fresh and charming." So there are two parts to this quote, and obviously we're using the ellipses to take out any of the information we don't need. So Gerald uses this quote to refer both to the women who are already at the Palace Theatre bar and also about Eva Smith. So when he says this is a deeply misogynistic remark, a remark that reveals that he doesn't treat women or think about women as his equals. Now that's a problem because Gerald's a member of the aristocracy, the upper class, and if he is looking down on others and seeing people who he believes to be less than him, it reveals quite a lot about Priestley's attitudes towards society. He says hate, and this verb obviously suggests a really intense feeling of disgust and dislike. Hate's actually used 6 times in the play, and 3 of those times are by Gerald, and 2 of them are to describe women. These strong feelings about women, again, they're misogynistic. They represent some of the patriarchal attitudes that have been used to oppress women. And to have such strong feelings suggests that he's also seen many of these women, enough to form this judgment. Eva then is not the first woman he's exploited. His feelings are based entirely on their appearances and Eva's appearance, and her worth and value is based entirely on what he can get out of her, how he can get something from her. He talks about the women being hard-eyed. Now that adjective is the opposite of the considered more desirable innocence that these sorts of men like to exploit. So this quote kind of delves into slightly uncomfortable territory when we start to talk about misogyny and patriarchy. It does suggest that they've been hardened or toughened by their experiences. So in the patriarchal world, the ideal of a woman is often to be soft and to be gentle. The phrase that we would often use when we're talking about women is doe-eyed, this sense that they are innocent and soft, but also suggests a sort of sexual allure. And those sorts of words, that sort of idea is one that agrees more readily with that patriarchal view that Gerald has of women. It is ironic, though, and being ironic, this irony is a technique, so we're definitely going to talk about this irony. The irony is that it's the exploitative patriarchal treatment these women have had that's made them hard-eyed. These are vulnerable women, and the rich and wealthy have exploited them. Gerald and men like Gerald have made them this way. They're now considered to be impure, and because they've seen and done unpleasant things, they're judged to be unpleasant. And it's, as I say, Gerald and people like him who have caused this thing that they hate. He uses the metaphor of dough-faced. Now, this is again slightly uncomfortable. We use our fists to knead dough, to knead it into shape, and it suggests that these women might have been knocked or shaped or moulded by others, possibly other people's fists, and by their experiences. There's a clear sense of violence here, and many of these women will have experienced physical and sexual violence as part of their life. Dough is malleable, which means it's easy to shape, and it suggests that these women have to be whatever the men exploiting them want them to be. They have to shape themselves, or are shaped by the men into the thing that the men want. The thing about dough is it's pale and it sags if it's left, and that suggests that these women have been drained as a result of their being kneaded into shape by these men. Their experiences, their life, their poverty has led them to look drained. And that's ugly to Gerald. He wants a woman who feels more, less used, I suppose, which again is a very uncomfortable idea. When many people talk about Gerald as being a less unpleasant character, when we start to delve into his attitudes here, it reveals him to actually have some really deep-rooted, problematic ideas. He talks about women, which is a plural noun, and it separates and compares the women that have been in this position longer than Eva has. So he's separating the women from Eva because he sees them as different, but she's in exactly the same position they are. She's just more desirable to Gerald. Many characters refer to them as girls. So the phrase girls is used a lot, particularly when we're talking about Eva. She's referred to as a girl quite a lot. But Gerald calls the other women here, well, he uses the word women. It's like they've become adults when they've become sexually available to him and men like him. There's that misogynistic idea then that a man, through his sexual acts, changes a girl into a woman. Again, these are quite difficult ideas, but they reveal a deep problem with Gerald and with some of the views of men in society at the time of this play. Now, these ideas might relate to the concept of the male gaze, that women should look a certain way for the benefit of the men who are looking at them, and their value is defined by their appearance. Now, this kind of gives men, in Gerald's position, an excuse to commit awful things on these women and to comment freely on their appearance, to reduce women to merely an object for men to enjoy. When he says young and fresh and charming, he's talking exclusively about Eva, so we can just talk about her now. He calls her young and fresh. Now, these are really uncomfortable ideas because they reinforce the objectification of women, something that existed in society then and sadly now, and particularly amongst men like Gerald. It's predatory behaviour. He sees her only in terms of an object, a young, fresh object. It values her based on her perceived virginity, which is just a concept created to allow men in patriarchal societies to give value to women they want to marry. Gerald and men like him have this idea that they want a young virgin woman, but after they're finished, the women are used up and their value decreases in the eyes of these men. The polysyndeton of young and fresh and charming, so the and in between each word, marks each word to be important on its own. It stands alone, as if these are the ideal standards of a woman: to be young, to be fresh, to be charming. Young is an adjective which suggests energy and life, and that's something that Gerald wants. It marks him as predatory. When he sees those things, he wants them. They're also slightly childlike qualities, to be young and to be full of life. And adults have authority over children. There's this sense that Gerald enjoys that sense of power. Again, this is really uncomfortable because obviously Eva's not a child, but he likes the idea of her being young so that he has power over her. It also suggests that she's innocent and in his eyes pure and vulnerable, and that inspires him to fulfill his desire to be heroic. He wants to feel like a protector. He wants to feel like he's saving her to fulfill the needs of his own ego. Now, the adjective fresh, again, it implies an object, like Eva is just an object, like fruit or meat. And fruit or meat that are fresh need to be consumed. They need to be eaten. Now, that's again really uncomfortable because Eva and girls like her and women like her, once they have been consumed, used up, they obviously are considered to be no use to society anymore in Gerald's eyes and people like Gerald. And this does happen to Eva. By the end of the play, she sadly dies as a result of her being used up by other people. Fresh has this implication of something that's new or unspoiled. And again, this links to the idea, again, quite misogynistic, very patriarchal, of judging women by how fresh they are, again, by their virginity. Now, that's a really patriarchal idea that gives Gerald permission to see her in that way. And it reminds us of this idea of a breath of fresh air, something that's a change from Sheila.